My role in this policymaker session is just to say a few words of introduction, just to remind you what RISIS is. There is something that many of you already knows, but it's a good thing for me to recall us what RISIS is supposed to provide and is providing to European researchers, and how the offers is evolving. In particular, we are now moving on building some very new things such as those ready-to-make indicators and ready-to-use indicators, sorry, and some advanced methodological training activities, which is called Method in Action and will start very soon. I want to point out this time what are the RISIS challenges we are facing now in this period of our activities. We are now a mature community, and our aim is basically structuring the research community, which is very vibrant but also dispersed. And the idea is to involve more and more scholars in projects that can be developed through the RISIS resources and can be allowed using the RISIS resources to gain results that never been possible otherwise or without other resources not integrated, such as those that we offer with our datasets and services. Also, we have the challenge of addressing differentiated sets of potential user communities, which includes also societal stakeholders, because our research community is very much devoted to the policymakers and other stakeholders in policymaking domain. And it's quite different to understand what they need and what they want to have, such as to data sets, data information, indicators, and so on. Also, we have the challenge of understanding and monitoring the impact of infrastructure and its effects on knowledge production. So what is the need of new indicators beyond those that are related to counting the access to projects and services, or publication as well. So what other kind of indicators we need to capture our impact? The fourth challenge is being proactive by anticipating users' needs. This is a major feature of our infrastructure, RISIS, because it is something that has a research content inside. And this content is developed by anticipating new services, new data to be provided for the community, because we imagine that they can become very soon at the core of the most important and possibly path-breaking research avenue. Also, fostering user engagement is one main challenge through various activities, seminars, policy seminars such as this one, support to scholars for access to datasets, training courses, and creative training, as I said. And here there are a few figures that we have mobilized for this user engagement. Now, okay, more specifically on the policy session. The policy sessions are mainly devoted to policy learning. This is quite important because they are devoted to show the novelty that emerge from data and what type of questions we can address for policy making. And so also they are policy learning in terms of understanding what we can learn as STI community. And we also have some documents which are very important, that are the policy brief. We are at the 9th policy brief summarizing the results and policy implication. And today the role is on the theme, no, sorry, this is a slide which is not been updated. I don't know why, because it is, maybe I follow, I have a different file, missed the right file. But anyway, the theme today is about social innovation. So this is just to understand what are the RISIS dataset families, which are 5 families: firm innovation, knowledge dynamics, PhD, and European career and European integration, and then policy learning. We also have 2 registers on firms and research organization. In this policy session, the dataset used is the new dataset in the families of the RISIS, and it's devoted to monitor social innovation. It's a unique research effort to deal with the controversial notion and a high challenging effort for collecting data. The topic addressed was social innovation in Europe, and the main things, as Abdullah will tell you, is about pointing out 4 components as constitutive elements of the different dimensions of the concept of social innovation to overcome the need of a stable definition of social innovation as well. So this is what I want to say. The speakers, these slides show you a brief presentation of the speaker we have today. We have Abdullah Gok, which is a senior lecturer at Strathclyde Business School. Then we have thank you very much to Dietmar Lampert as a discussant, which is a researcher at the Center for Social Innovations in Austria. And we will have as a closing interview discussant Philippe Laredo, which is the coordinator of RISIS infrastructure. So thank you very much. This is the last slides in which you can find all our link to the social and media and to our webpage. So visit them in order to be updated about our activities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Emanuela. I wish to invite Abdullah to share the screen and begin the presentation of this very interesting study. Welcome, Abdullah. You can go. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessia. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emanuela, for the introduction. So as Emanuela already hinted, our talk is about a particular database, one of the many databases within RISIS. And our database is called European Social Innovation Database. So what I'm going to do for the next half an hour, is that first I'll introduce the database of European social innovation. And then I'll present a first analysis, an exploratory analysis, asking the question, what is really social innovation in practice? Okay. So we know social innovation is increasingly recognized as an important driver of change. We know, for instance, that for European Union, it is one of the important policy priorities. There's an increasing interest for policymakers almost in every country. And there's also a scholarly interest. Number of publications on the topic of social innovation is increasing. And all these interest also points out social innovation as an important driver of change. And I think the pandemic also kind of strengthened this trend of social innovation as a driver of change. And this is a part of a bigger trend, maybe. It is part of a trend of new forms of innovation. We see that innovation is being diversified. There are new forms, new ways of doing innovation. It is not only an activity that firms do for business value, but there's an increasing recognition that there are new types of innovation, and social innovation is one of the foremost examples of this. Nevertheless, the term is not new. The term social innovation has been in circulation since the 19th century. In fact, you can see hints and even sometimes the use of exact term in, Weber and Emil Durkheim and even Marx. But in spite of this long history of the concept, and in spite of a recent take-up since 2000s, early 2000s, the concept of social innovation still lacks clarity. If you look at literature, for instance, academic literature, I would say 80% of literature is about the definition of social innovation, what social innovation exactly means. And there's a huge definitional debate in the literature. And sometimes you see the correspondence of a definitional debate in academic, in policy literature as well. So the purpose of this presentation then is to present European Social Innovation Database, but also, shed some light on this definitional debate with real life data, because the previous definitional debate is really very conceptual. Okay, so let me start with data on social innovation. The data is one of the barriers for better understanding of social innovation, because unlike conventional forms of innovation, such as patents, publications, financial data, and so on, we don't have, stable definitions. We don't have guidelines. We don't have established indicators for social innovation, whereas we have a long history of all these things for conventional sources of innovation. There's, for instance, Frascati Manual, Oslo Manual, commonly accepted statistical definitions, more or less commonly accepted ways of making indicators for these kind of things. But for social innovation, we don't have any of these. And this is one of the barriers for better understanding of the concept itself, which is becoming really important. There has been a number of previous attempts to collect data on social innovation, and they have been mainly funded by the European Commission. However, there were some really serious limitations. So these kind of small databases, if you like the term of database, they were really very limited in size and scope. So European Union commissioned a few smaller databases on aging, on digital social innovation, and smaller thematic areas. And the number of projects that these smaller attempts of databases were quite small. And you see a common theme in all these previous databases. They're all human input. And it is quite difficult to input such a data by the help of humans, either through surveys or case studies or social innovation user inputted kind of data. Not only it relies on understanding of individual people, and therefore having stable definitions and harmonizing is difficult, but also it is quite unsustainable if you rely only on human input, because whenever the project ends, the database is old, is already old. So that was the motivation for ESSET, European Social Innovation Database. We thought we need better data for social innovation, and we created this database. This was first initially created as part of EU-funded NOMAC project, and there's a little bit of dashboard. That data was quite limited, quite experimental, and we are further developing this database as part of RISIS 2 project, as part of a much larger consortium. So we have a particular approach, which is quite different than the previous attempts of collecting data on social innovation. So if you remember, I already mentioned that the previous data sources were all human inputted, and they were not maybe as sustainable as you wish. And we thought social innovation by its very nature is, it's social, and it reveals a lot of information. These projects would like to reveal a lot of information themselves on public venues, especially on their websites. Therefore, we thought maybe rather than relying on human coding, we could do something, a semi-automated method, by crawling the websites of social innovation projects, by identifying projects in that way, and by also characterizing the projects in that way. So that is, the main philosophy of ACID. Rather than relying on exclusively human coding, utilize semi-automatic advanced machine learning and natural language processing techniques to identify projects and to characterize projects from the websites that these projects have. And of course, nothing is fully automatic. It's not possible to do a fully automatic thing. We also use some human input, but the mix is much more on the side of machine learning. We use human annotation to train the machine learning models because you need to teach your models to identify these things and to characterize, and also to ensure the quality and integrity of the data. So our method is a semi-automatic method, I would say, predominantly machine learning, but also a certain extent of human annotation, human coding. Okay, then the promise of our database is that, as opposed to previous attempts, is to have a database thematically more comprehensive, having significantly more recall than the existing databases, and having a consistent and flexible conceptual structure in terms of defining social innovation, which I'll explain in a great detail in a minute. And we have much richer information, because if you look at the previous databases, they had limited information about the projects that they have. Not only not a lot of projects, but also not a lot of information on these projects. And we hope that ACID, because it relies on human coding, but also mainly semi-automatic information retrieval and discovery techniques, is more sustainable. The data can be collected with much less effort when the funding disappears or decreases. Okay, so let me introduce ACID a little bit more in a few more slides, and then I'll go to my research question. The main entity in the database is social innovation projects. So we are working with social innovation projects, as opposed to actors or actors who are conducting these projects and so on. So our main entity is social innovation projects. For each project, we have a number of different information. We have scores of social innovation, and I'll come to that. I'll explain that in a minute. We have a location for each project in terms of country, city, NUTS region, and approximate coordinates. We have some topics that are developed by our partners of University of Sheffield. They are in terms of key enabling technologies and societal grand challenges, but they are developing SDGs, UN SDGs as well. But you will see in this study at the moment, the topics that we are talking about are Horizon 2020 priority areas. We have a short summary for each of the projects. We have an URL of the project, the website of the project, and we have the source from which we identify these projects. Okay, so this is the architecture of ACID. I think one thing to note here is that ACID is a kind of iterative database. So when we started collecting our data as part of NOMAC a few years ago, what we did is to bring together all these existing databases, because they contain valuable information, they contain what social innovation is. And for these machine learning methods that we are developing, you need a seed data. You need to teach your models what social innovation is. So we started with most obvious sources, previous databases, and we are gradually identifying projects and characterizing them from less relevant sources. And I think in the one end of spectrum, which we started is, previous database of social innovation. And the other extreme of the spectrum is, crawling the open web, as we call going wild, trying to kind of extract and identify these projects from, completely unrelated sources. So there's a spectrum that we are exploiting, and I would say we are progressing steadily more and more to kind of less relevant sources which might contain information, but less obvious to extract this kind of information. Okay, so we have our data, of course. We have the structured data, the features that I mentioned to you. They're in an SQL database, and we have, this is in principle open, and there's a controlled access through RISIS. If you go to the RISIS website, you can apply to obtain their data. And for research purposes, we are more than happy to share our data with you. But there's also a kind of a backend database of all these websites, unstructured information, and this is closed because this is very raw data. The code of our database is fully open, it's in GitHub. And we have three types of interfaces. First, we have an internal project quality control interface when we do our annotations and checks. We have an interface in NOMAC project, but this is a kind of an older version of data, but this is integrated with other kinds of indicators as well. The website is here. And then the most recent version is a kind of a tool that we pull together for this seminar, but also for other users. I would like to show you a little bit, a small demo on this. Just give me a moment. The address is here. So when you go to this address, present in the slide as well, and Alessia posted in chat, I see, you see a small tool. There's a little bit of explanation of methodology if you click on the methodology tab on the left. And also if you click on view projects, you see a list of projects, and these are all the projects that are included in our database. You can filter them, and I'll talk about these filters in a moment, but you can filter them by topics or by social innovation scores, and you can click on the link and you can see what kind of source that we found these projects from, and you can see a map. But also if you click on data analysis, you will see a number of tabs that I will explain today, but you can also play with these kind of things by changing the filters for yourself. I will show more general things, but if you would like to see how this kind of a general thing in France, you can filter by France, and you can customize the analysis that I'm going to show to you. So I'm just returning to the presentation, but you can play with this tool while I'm talking. Okay, and please let me know if you have any difficulty in accessing the tool. Okay, so I'll talk about, I think, 2 more slides on assets, and then jump into my research question. So a little bit of information of the coverage at the moment. So we have about 11,000 projects in asset from 150 countries, and you see the map, and you can see these projects in the tool yourself as well. But this 11,000 projects includes negatives as well, because we need projects that are not social innovation to teach our machine learning model what is social innovation, what is not as well. So we need a balanced training model. And we also, this is a machine learning based model, this is work in progress. For some projects, we don't have all the information that I showed you. For instance, for some projects, we know the country, but we are not yet very sure about the city or the coordinates. And for some projects, they are not in the topics of Horizon 2020 priorities, but they're on other topics, so on. So if you look at positive projects with most of the information, we have about 6,300 projects. Okay, but there is a spectrum. So between 6,300 and 11,400, there are many projects that has some missing information as well. That might be positive or negative. Okay, so let me return to my research question. And to be able to answer my research question, I need to talk about a little bit conceptually what is social innovation. As I mentioned, social innovation is quite a vague concept, and there's no stable definition. And there's a huge debate in the literature what social innovation exactly means. And if you look at this literature, there has been a lot of attempts prior to look at these different definitions, to classify them, and so on. We looked at this literature, and we did our own literature review as well. And what we came up is that among these hundreds of different definitions in policy documents, but also in the common academic literature, maybe there are 4 elements that each definition uses in different combinations. So for some people, objectives are really very important for social innovation. So social innovation projects need to satisfy societal needs, including needs of particular social groups, or aim at social value creation. And the target needs not met by conventional innovative activity that is a goal or end product. And if you look at, for instance, European Union definition, objectives are important. The second criteria that people use, or second dimension, let's say, is that actors and actor interactions are important. So some people define social innovation as something that includes actors who would not normally get involved in economic innovation or conventional innovation activity. And some other people think social innovation as something that has social, new types of social interactions that based on user community participation and rely on trust relationship rather than solely mutual benefit and so on. Again, European Union definition has some emphasis on actor interactions. For some other people, for instance, for Muller, social innovation is not about these objectives or actors so much, but it's about outputs and outcomes. Social innovation is type of innovation that changes attitudes, behaviors, perceptions of actors involved, and it produces, long-term institutional cultural change, or what Nelson says, produce social technologies rather than physical technologies. So this is a kind of a particular thing that some definitions say as well. And finally, if you look at the difference between social innovation and social entrepreneurship, which are confused a lot, there's an element of innovativeness in social innovation, whereas there's lower innovativeness in social entrepreneurship. So there's an emphasis on the innovativeness dimension of these projects to be able to distinguish them from social entrepreneurship. So these are the four almost categories, building blocks, that people use to define social innovation. And for instance, European Union definition takes objectives and actors, criteria 1 and criteria 2. For Muller, it is really objectives and more outcomes. And for some other people, innovativeness is more important. So this is what literature tells us. And when we looked at this problem of defining social innovation, because especially if you are using a machine learning technique, you need to define the concept really very well. Otherwise, the machine doesn't understand. And the machine in general doesn't understand if you have a vague umbrella concept. And it understands better if you have, modules, parts of the concept. You can teach the model better with that kind of a thing. So we thought, rather than having a model with a strict definition of what social innovation is and is not, we can use these four criteria that people use in different combinations, and we can give a score to each of the projects that we have in the database on the basis of these four criteria. So for instance, each of our projects have a score for objectives, and each of our projects have a score for actors and actor interactions, outputs and outcomes, and innovativeness. So what you have eventually, you have 4 scores for each project, and you can then construct your own definition, how you see social innovation. So if you see, for instance, social innovation more about objectives and actors, you look for higher score, projects with higher scores in these 2 dimensions, and maybe don't care about these 2, the last 2 much. So for every project, we have a score ranging from 0 to 2. 0 means there's no indication of this kind of a dimension in the website, and 2 means fully satisfy the meaning of the criteria, and 1 is the middle option. So as I mentioned, we don't have a particular social innovation definition, but we encompass, we cover all the definitions that people use on social innovation, and the users of our database can filter the projects according to whatever definition that they have, according to importance of these 4 criteria. And we can, you can filter on the basis of these. And we have, as I mentioned, a score from 0 to 2. We experimented with various different bins for these scores. We use a 3-point bin at the moment, 0, not, and all, and a middle range score. And we kind of observed that 0 to 2 is best performing in terms of machine learning models, because machine can understand the extremes 0 and 2, and it can understand the middle range score. But if you have too many middle range scores, the model confuses. And this is the same thing with humans. Humans perform best in categorizing this to a 3-point bin, 2 extremes, not and all, and also a kind of a middle range score. And it is easier to analyze as well. Okay, so I would like to talk as a last thing on the database, on the performance of our models. So we tried a number of different things, different kinds of machine learning models. These are the performances for each of these criteria: objectives, actors, outputs, and innovators. P shows precision, R shows recall, and F1 is a kind of an overall measure that brings precision and recall. So there are different techniques, machine learning techniques, and we experimented with a lot of things, and we eventually found that BERT, a model called BERT, is performing best. This BERT model kind of correctly classifies project scores in each of the 4 criteria about 90%. And this is extraordinarily high. This is extremely high, I would say, especially when you consider the fact that even humans don't agree on all these scores, because it's subjective, and it requires a level of understanding of social innovation and so on. So 90% F1 score is extraordinarily high, but nevertheless we have 10% of error margin. And when you analyze the data, especially when you look at the data, for instance, the project, you will see some projects that are not, look like social innovation, and that is normal. That's part of the limitations of this kind of a model. And I hope it is not more than 10%, and the model shows that the error is not more than 10%. And the final thing I would like to say here, the model that we are using, BERT, is the state-of-art model. This is what Google uses. It's a kind of a transformer-based kind of a model. It is, it takes into consideration of context. I won't go into, technical details here, but what we are doing is that the classical models don't take the context of a sentence, whereas the BERT model looks at the context of a sentence, doesn't treat every word in the same sentence as same, but looks at which word comes from or begin or before or after a certain word, and so on, and it makes a kind of a complex calculation. And this is the state-of-art kind of a model that is used for these kind of purposes. Okay, so I explained that we have a good, extraordinary level of performance of these machine learning models, but nevertheless there is a 10% error, margin of error in this, and you have this kind of a margin error, even larger margin of error in human inputted databases even, but just to set the expectations when you look at the source data as well. Okay, so let me go to my research question. What is social innovation? And I mentioned to you, we don't have a definition of social innovation, but there are various definitions. And I mentioned to you that there are 4 criteria that people use to define social innovation in different combinations. So this graph shows this is distribution of these scores and their relationship to each other in our database for the data of 6,000 projects. And as you see, about 70% of projects have a score of 1 for objectives, and about 6.5% of projects have a score of 0 for objectives, and about a quarter of projects have a score of 2 for objectives. And similar pictures for actors and outputs and innovators, and there's a little bit of relationship. So I think you observe 2 things here. First, the scores are distinct. Even though you have a lot of scores that are 1 in all of the projects, the correlation coefficient between these 4 scores is about 0.4, which is acceptable. So they show distinct things. This is the first thing that you note. And the second thing that you note, there is a sizable number of projects that scores high in one criteria and low in other criteria, or vice versa. Yeah. So there are lots of projects, for instance, that score 0 in one criteria and 1 and 2 in other criteria as well. And this is the basis of our argument now. So if you look at the types, so what we consider then to look at this distribution of scores, 4 different scores to projects. And one thing you can drive from this kind of a picture is that these are scores, this is a way of filtering the projects. And as I mentioned, for instance, for European Union, the objectives needs to be 2, actors needs to be 2, and nothing else matters. And there are lots of projects, for instance, that score 0 and 0 in objectives and actors. European Union wouldn't consider them social innovation. So you can consider all these scores and their combination as, you know, a kind of a definition, to construct the definition of social innovation. But also another way of looking at this problem is that maybe they indicate a type of social innovation. So I'll give you a spoiler on my conclusion. Maybe there is no single universal strict definition of social innovation, but there are different types of social innovation. And this is what we exactly have done. We looked at different types of social innovation, and we classified, you know, projects on the basis of, you know, combinations of these 4 scores. So for instance, balanced means all 4 criteria scored same, and about 50% of projects are balanced type. Multiple orientation is quite similar to balanced. 2 or 3 criteria scored same for a project, and about 30% of our projects are multiple orientations as well. And bear in mind that most definitions combine 2 or 3 criteria together to construct a definition of social innovation in the scholarly literature or in policy literature. But there's also a sizable number of projects that has 1 criteria, you know, much more important than the others. For instance, there's about 8% of projects, about 500 projects, that the criterion objectives is much more important than another criteria. So criterion objective scores 2 or 1, and the other scores 0 or 1. And same thing with outputs, actors, and innovators. So about these boxes are the projects where 1 criteria out of 4 is much more important than the others. And this is really important because, as I mentioned, most definitions combine multiple criteria together. So in effect, these colors, objectives oriented, outputs oriented, actor oriented, and innovators oriented, are the projects that most definitions wouldn't consider social innovation because they look at, you know, 2 criteria out of 4. And these are the projects where 1 criteria is much more important than the others. Yeah. So these are generally the projects that you wouldn't consider social innovation. And they are really very interesting because they show you, you know, how having a strict definition kind of misses an important portion of social innovation landscape in practice. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next a few slides, I think 4 slides, is to dig down almost these types, these special types of social innovation, objectives oriented, output oriented, actor oriented, and innovators oriented, and try to understand their characteristics. So what these projects are, what these projects that we wouldn't normally consider social innovation are about, and why they are important. And I'll not show much in the rest of the presentation of the balanced and multiple orientation types, because these are the, you know, more conventional social innovation definitions. Okay, so this is a cross of the previous 2 slides. So it just shows how scores distribute according to these types that we created. For instance, this is balanced, where each score of all of the 4 scores are the same. Yeah. So 1, for instance, this is balanced, and this the other colors are different types. And as I mentioned, for instance, let's look at actors oriented, or maybe objectives oriented, even better. Objective oriented projects are projects where objectives score much higher than another score. And if you see, this is the blue color, pale blue color, and it scores 2 for objectives and, you know, 1 or 0 for other scores. Just a kind of another representation of the types, of the special types that we will look at in a minute. Okay, so if you look at these types, remember the types that we are really interested in, special and interesting types, are the types where 1 criteria is much more important than the other criteria. So unbalanced types, let's say. If you look at, for instance, distribution of these types to geography, you see a very clear picture. So for instance, innovators-oriented projects are projects where innovators is much more important than other criteria, is much higher, this is the green color, in North America than any other geography, which is probably what you expect because of the innovation gap, Silicon Valley, more innovative orientedness in North American, science and innovation system. And if you look at, for instance, objectives-oriented projects, they are, quite high in any geography that is not Europe, non-EU Europe, and also EU Europe. And non-EU Europe here means UK mainly, but also, associated countries, Switzerland, Norway, and some other countries as well. EU is EU27, which excludes UK. And if you look at that, objectives-oriented is quite low in Europe, and it's quite high in North America and other geographies as well, which is quite interesting as well. And if you look at, for instance, other categories as well, they are quite high in non-EU Europe and outside of EU domain as well. And one explanation of this is that in all these geographies that are outside of Europe, the governments do not have a very strict definition of social innovation in their support. But also, they don't have that policy language. But European Union have a lot of emphasis on social innovation. They have a preferred definition, which in fact takes both actors and objectives together, and they stress on both of these criteria together. And as you see in geographies where you have a strict definition, the projects and their scores fit into the policy language, the policy push in a way. And where, geographies, you don't have a strict definition of governments, of policymakers, you have a much more, natural balanced distribution of these types. And I think this is one observation. And the other observation we already mentioned, innovativeness is much higher, almost 3 times much higher. Innovativeness-oriented projects is much higher in North America than Europe. This is really very interesting as well. And this, in a way, shows a different policy pool, because the policy pool in North America, for instance, is not on a particular type of social innovation, but more on innovativeness. And it shows, that effect of policy pool. Okay, so this is geography. And if you look at the topics, distribution of these special types that we are interested in, where one factor is much more important than the others, to the topics. And remember, these are the topics where EU has priorities. These are Horizon 2020 societal grand challenges. And if you look at the distribution of these topics and these special types to these topics, we see that some topics are kind of much more important than the others. For instance, the health-related topics in Horizon 2020 priorities is much more important than the others, especially in these types. Whereas, for instance, society-related topics, and this is a really umbrella category in Horizon 2020 priorities. It includes, poverty reduction, inclusion, and so on, a kind of a huge range of topics. And you would expect this society-related topics would have much more importance for social innovation projects, because these society-related topics are kind of bulk of the social problems that these projects try to solve. You see these society-related projects have more types, have more distribution in balanced types and multiple oriented types, which we don't show in this graph, which kind of means that the broad priorities of EU projects also, push projects to, a particular definition that EU forces. And also, if you look at, for instance, all projects without a topic distribution, you see, for instance, about 2% of them are innovativeness-oriented. Innovativeness is much more important than other criteria. But if you look at projects that hit a topic that is about a EU priority, you see less innovativeness in general. So again, this shows us that the EU has some priorities, and EU has a particular social innovation definition, and the EU definition, EU priorities kind of push projects with kind of a certain language, certain categorization, which I'll come in a moment. Okay, this is the next slide. This is, a distribution of topics by region. And again, this is the cross between the previous 2 slides that I showed you. this kind of shows all these topics, EU priority areas, and their distribution of or to geographies. I think striking thing is that this color, magenta color, is no topics associated. So these projects are not likely to be related with the Horizon 2020 SDG topics. And if you look at North America, about 40% of projects have no topics associated. And this is expected because they are not on EU priorities, for instance. But if you look at EU, no topics associated is about 10%. And again, you see a huge policy push here, huge policy influence here. Projects in EU are on the topics that EU has a priority. And you see, for instance, non-EU follows this as well, because even non-EU countries have a significant association with EU priorities. Okay, let me conclude. In conclusion, the practical reality of social innovation does not correspond to strict and simple definitions featured in academic literature, especially the EU definition. If you take a very strict EU definition, and this is similar in in other circles as well, other definitions, you disregard a good portion of projects that you might otherwise consider social innovation. And in the case of EU definition, it's about at least a quarter of projects. And this is maybe not a good situation, because this might mean that you lose a good portion of projects because you don't consider them social innovation. But also, this might lead to a situation where you underappreciate some of these features. You underappreciate innovativeness, and you underappreciate, long-term societal change, the outcomes, by taking a really very strict definition and by pushing that language of definition really very strictly to bottom up. So rather than looking at these definitions as binary types, a project is social innovation or not, maybe a more helpful thing is to think about these criteria as types, as different types of social innovation, and to have a kind of a more flexible, more inclusive definition and talk about types rather than, binary inclusion and exclusion criteria. And we see this also kind of results in a kind of a significant policy pull, especially in the EU, but in other countries as well. And maybe there are two reasons for that. First, there's a practical pull. Policy supports, policy encourages, and policy influences projects to be on a certain, understanding of social innovation and certain topics. I think this is, obvious. But also maybe a secondary effect at the same time, which is rhetoric. And this means that, EU has a certain rhetoric. And, projects, actors who are on the ground, adopt this rhetoric, adopt this kind of certain type of language, because they're exposed to this kind of a literature, they're exposed to, that top-down language that they are imposed on them. So this effect, this mix of effect that I showed you is probably practically true. There's a policy pull, but also maybe a kind of a rhetoric element here. And I think one disadvantage of that kind of a thing is that it might reduce diversity. And remember, this is a kind of new forms of innovation. This is emerging, this is rapidly changing. And this is one of the fundamental characteristics of social innovation, being, emergent, being bottom up and changing really very rapidly. But when you have really strict definitions, and when you consider these definitions and, topics really in a very, really strict sense, the rhetorical and practical policy pull maybe reduce diversity, which might be, not beneficial to a social innovation ecosystem. I'll finish by two last slides. So this is ACID. This is ACID. This is what we are doing, and this is a kind of a small analysis. And I will talk about 1 minute on our development plan and another minute how you can contribute to this. So we want to do three things as part of the remaining of our time with RISIS. So we started in NORMAC, I think 2,000 projects. We have now 11,000 projects. We would like to increase the number of projects to about 20,000 short term and maybe much more than we have. So to have better coverage, and we call this expansion. And we would like to extend some of the features that we have. I mentioned some of the features, but we also would like to mine the missions, product services, outputs, impacts of these projects as well to do a kind of a valuable analysis. Another alternative is to look at actors who are behind these projects, project owners, funders, and partners. And it is really very organic. And we are kind of really open to other ideas. If you want kind of a different future to be in ACID, we are open to that. And the advantage of machine learning models is that the source data is there, the website is there. We identify projects, we extract some of the features and characteristics. But if you want to extract something more, if you want to know about the emissions and products and outputs, the data is already collected. It's quite easy to return back to source data and to extract these features. So that is a kind of a one added advantage, and we are focusing on these two things, but we are really very open to hear your ideas as well. And finally, at the moment, we crawl the websites of projects once, and we characterize them, and we record all these websites. But we also would like to have a more dynamic retrieval. We would like to crawl these websites maybe 2 times a year, 3 times a year, and to see the changes in these projects, because some projects die, some projects change topics, some projects change, influence and emphasis and so on, and we would like to track this and in effect to convert our data to a time series data. And these are the 3 things that we are going to do as part of our next 2 years in RISIS project. So how you can contribute and get this data, this is my last slide. You can access the underlying data, it's open. You need to apply through RISIS, and we are very happy to help you. You can use the tool that I showed to you. This is a kind of a snapshot. It doesn't show all the data, but it helps you to have a good sense of the data and a little bit of the analysis that we have done today. And this tool is here and it will continue. But also we can work together. We are very happy to work together. If you have any ideas that utilize ACID or that might even expand ACID, that might add new features in terms of new research questions, we are also happy to engage with anybody who has ideas as well. I think that was all my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm I think a little bit over the time, but that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for your intense journey into ACID, European Social Innovation Database. And for having illustrated also the future perspective and scenario. And I really appreciated your invitation to work together. In this part of the conference, I will reserve a space at the end for a question from the floor. I will give the floor now to Dietmar Lampert, Social Innovation Center. So Dietmar, the floor is yours. You can share the screen if you wish.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to share it now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Very good.
Thank you.
So I believe you can see my slides as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really good to be here and see you again. Just a brief overview. I would like to revisit a bit the need for social innovation database and the chosen approach. I believe it's worth discussing it very briefly, and then I would like to show quite briefly also what our relation is to maybe ACID and what we expect from its use for our own research. And then I would like to comment a bit on selected results that Abdullah just has presented, and then possibly discuss a couple of future developments. Okay, so why am I here? Basically, I think there are several reasons. ZSI has been part of the NOMAC project, which is now under the auspices of RISIS 2, and its purpose was to develop a platform for especially policymakers and analysts, and part of that was the ACID. And I remember back quite fondly to the humble beginnings that we supported the site together with Abdullah and his team. And I think the precursor to the ACID was the SI Drive project, which we were also part of. It was quite a manual effort, so to say, and a good benchmark, I believe, for ACID. I think ACID has progressed way beyond SI Drive, but more to that later. And also SATISI has been a long part of the conversation. We exist for more than 30 years now, so Nomen est Omen, I hope. And we are very much interested in advancing the discussions in the theoretical field as well. Okay, so I believe there is a need for ACID because, as Abdullah also said, there is no mature consolidated source. So if we are serious in trying to better understand where social innovation occurs, what kind of factors lead to social innovation, and also maybe from the perspective of policymakers and research funders, try to improve the framework conditions that support the emergence of social innovation or provide the conditions for the transactions necessary to make social innovation a reality. And of course, also understand the links to other types of innovations. And just very briefly, since I also know about the manual effort that was behind the Social Innovation Drive project, it was quite substantial. I don't think it's sustainable to conduct it biannually or annually. And if you don't do that, you're quite outdated quickly, as Abdullah just said. I think they have aspirations maybe to do it semi-annually or even more often, which I think would be a plus. But I also understand that even though you do it, using technology, it's still quite a big effort. So I appreciate all that you are doing, Abdullah and your team. Just maybe a bit what we are doing so that you understand where I'm coming from. So we are currently working on a study for the Swiss National Science Foundation, and the project is called Social Innovation as Evaluation and Outcome Category of SNF funded research. It's quite a mouthful, but the idea will be obvious in a minute in my next slide. Just for those who don't know the SNSF, I believe probably all do, but what they do is they fund all basic sciences in all disciplines. They take it quite seriously to remain independent of any political influences, and are a staunch defender of funding bottom-up research. So I think they are quite exceptional in that regard in Europe. And in this project, they are motivated to consider the value of their funding from different angles, and in this particular case, from social innovation. So our research questions are, and we follow a multi-method approach, but in essence, we are more exploratory in nature because this is the first time that this is being done. So we have quite a strong qualitative nature, a qualitative focus, and it is in the back of our minds made it to follow up with a more quantitative approach. And this is also one of the reasons why it's interesting for us also to triangulate maybe our results with the results of ACID. But our research questions currently are basically how often and how social innovation is actually approached by SNSF-funded projects, and what the contribution is of the project towards social innovation. Where are the limits? How far can they go? What kind of role also play productive interactions? And this is also, Abdullah, what you had in your dimension on the actors and the interactions between actors. And is social innovation suitable, at least as a starting point, for the evaluation of funded research? And I think that's a fairly new question, an interesting question, raises a lot of criticism. But again, we are at the beginning of this, and we are in the middle of the study, so there's no conclusion yet. We are working on a sample of data across different scientific disciplines, age, academic age, gender, program types, organization types. So it was quite important for us to have a good coverage. So this is really important. And what is interesting to us, or at least was important for us to do, is meet the challenges, and those are quite many. As Abdullah also told in his presentation, there is a lack of conceptual clarity. There's no one definition, one true definition, an all-encompassing definition, which is commonly the case, of course, in most theoretic fields. But that means for us, it is quite a challenge to operationalize the concept of social innovation. So we had to come up with a meaningful approach to do that. And interestingly, we resulted basically in the same approach as Abdullah and the ACID have followed, which is to go beyond the definitions and find meaningful ways to cluster certain properties, for a lack of a better word, that you find in social innovation, and then see where it makes sense, how to cluster them, and then examine the data along these kind of dimensions, right? And so we, of course, understand and support the approach chosen by ACID. And again, we follow a similar approach. There are some slight differences. The ACID, you label it, Abdullah, for example, objectives. We label it solution orientation. You have a focus on actors and actor interactions. We called it actors and networks. You call it innovativeness. We have it novelty in a context, because something can be existing already, but new to maybe different social groups, right? So there is a novelty in play, and I think the outcomes and outputs are completely the same. You see the high alignment, and it's really encouraging to see that you arrive at the same conclusion, basically coming from a bit of a different angle. I believe we have a more criteria, at least our approach, and this was not covered in your presentation, but it's in the background papers that are out there, that are available for everyone to read. I believe we have more criteria, but first of all, we have a bit more luxury than you do, because we are now in the statistical analytical phase. But having said that, it's not necessarily that important, because we don't know yet how significant those criteria are. So we are still in the middle of analyzing this, and we will know more at the end of the study, which is the end of April. But for the moment, I just wanted to mention that our concept is a bit wider, but it could well be that we arrive actually at the same criteria as you do, because it's probably comes down also to feasibility, right? What is there in the data? As you say, there's no one really good data, and you need to scramble and gather different, tap into different sources and so on. So that's the caveat here. And that's just to understand maybe my comments. So I appreciate that you are also shining a light on the different types of social innovation. So again, that we go beyond the current limitations of the definitions that we find out there. So I think this is worth highlighting. And also this scoring idea, it corresponds, yes, with our approach as well. So the scores will be, we are already working on different models, but more than our work is probably that we can already say that through your work, you are now broadening the discussions, what accounts for social innovation. And I think this is really a substantial step. I mean, there were in the literature, you can find certain traces or evidences that this is the case. But I think with the kind of data that you now provide, the kind of tool that you now provide, that it's fairly easy to use. I think this is a really good step in the right directions. And I think the next logical step will be then to discuss basically, yes, so you have these kind of different dimensions, and what would be, for example, a minimum threshold that you need to reach to consider something a social innovation. So you may have a degree of social innovation, for also, again, for a lack of a better word, because this is fairly new, right? So I think these are two major contributions that you already offer, I believe, to the research community, which are quite remarkable. And for me personally, I found your presentation interesting in the sense that there are regional differences. I believe policy pull is a possible explanation. I think more research is needed. I believe there are different factors as well. For example, I know from personal experience that just to go to the slide that you showed before, to the results, North America, for example, where you can see the kind of orientation that they mainly have in comparison to Europe. And I would personally be interested to see where Switzerland lies in that regard, because this is exactly the focus of our study. And I know that, for example, they have similarities, Switzerland and US, for example. So I would venture they are fairly similar in that they are funding bottom-up research mainly, so curiosity-driven research, and especially in the United States, innovation is almost completely in the hands of the industry, or maybe in terms of social innovation, more of societal actors. But again, I would be interested in seeing where Switzerland lies, and I think just what I have gathered, your tool allows to filter, of course, countries, so that's a good feature. And we can already see here, innovativeness, interestingly, has no score of 0, right? And that maybe goes into this, or supports this notion that, yes, Switzerland could be the exception in Europe. But again, I would like to see more on that, and that leads me to the improvements maybe later on. Just the final point here, you have presented results on the more topical front, but I believe they are probably heavily depending on the ontology that you're using, because you're focusing, and this is probably more the history of ESID, right? That you have your roots in NOMAC, which focused again just to demonstrate the feasibility of the approach on the societal grand challenges, which are not called differently in Horizon Europe, and all the key enabling technologies. So I would venture that, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say. What degree the ontology influences the results, and do you experiment with further ontologies? How is your situation there? Is there still differences? Are there more pronounced differences? Because I believe the data is could be skewed in the kind of categorization that you're currently using. Okay, so to discuss a bit the possible future developments. I don't know whether this is a possibility. You were asking for potential contributions, maybe from the research community, and maybe even from research funders or policymakers, right? Sometimes they do have their own data. And is this in discussion? Maybe could this be a potential area to expand? I know there is a huge array of challenges involved because you need to tailor to a certain degree to custom data sets, of course. But I would be interested in seeing what is possible, accepting potentially some limitations. But more than that, and maybe Abdullah, this goes back to the very beginning, one of the first workshops that we discussed in covering social innovation projects, that there is probably a large chunk, but this is unknown, of social innovation projects that don't have any web presence. And I'm wondering if there is maybe a possibility, maybe when you expand your data sources, to maybe include offline ones. Maybe this corresponds as well with the first point that they make. Maybe there are national, regional funders who have some kind of inventory or a catalog, maybe foundations who are active in supporting social innovation projects, and maybe certain societies. just an idea, but I would like to hear your thoughts. And I know social media channels are in discussions, and they bring with them a fair amount of noise. So I was wondering whether you were discussing a selection, certain platform that could be useful, maybe some certain professional ones. I know you have tapped recently into Ashoka. I know you're thinking about this, but it would be interesting to see what others you have in discussion. And again, this relates to deontology. It would be good to see what kind of alternatives you're thinking about, and whether it could be possible for users to choose between different ontologies when they're analyzing the data. So that could be a potential plus for users of ESID. And of course, I would encourage you to explore further features of ESID, of the tool itself. So thank you for sharing the link to the online tool. So I think it's an interesting first glance. And I believe you're probably in the early stages of this and are probably improving the usability anyway. And so I would encourage you in pursuing the kind of features together, possibly with the users and the community. So that leads me to my final words. I really have to tip my figurative hat to you for this huge leap forward. So within a short amount of time, you really have now tremendously increased the value of ESID, I believe. So I was, of course, aware of the potential in the beginning, but now I'm starting to get excited about what can be done through ESID. So from our side at ZSI, with our current research endeavors, we would be interested in benchmarking our findings with the capabilities of what ESID has to offer and triangulating the results of our model and theory building with your ideas. So this is maybe not directly possible through ESID, I believe, not yet at least. But I think you are pursuing similar goals. Maybe we can contribute to the discussion, to the scholarly discussion there together. Of course, you open now the discussion, or broaden at least the discussion on the kind of degrees of social innovation projects and what accounts for social innovation. And yeah, I believe your achievements allow for many future possibilities to develop further the tool, and I would be interested in hearing what kinds you intend or already plan or consider picking up in the future. Okay, thank you so much for your time, and good on you.
Thank you so much, Dietmar Lampert, Center for Social Innovation, for your suggestions and for your very valuable contribution. Now I will open the floor to the discussion, to the question. And I wish to ask to Abdullah if you want to add something to the intervention of Dietmar right now.
Thank you very much, Alessia, and thanks, Dietmar. It was an excellent intervention, and I think you raised a number of really very different, really very important questions. That some of which we are thinking, but some of which we haven't thought, and that is very useful for us, to think about these questions. Okay, I'll start with the easy ones. Ontology. I think you are absolutely right. We had an ontology of Horizon 2020 priorities, and this is, a historical artifact of the evolution of the project, because we had a prior project which depended on that kind of an ontology. But in RISIS, we partner with University of Sheffield, who developed the ontology for us, but who are working on UN SDGs as well. And there's a huge research at the moment, especially in the NLP domain, to classify text to UN SDGs. And I think this is much more modern, and this is much more sustainable, I think much more widely accepted. And I think this will tell us much more things in terms of our analysis of data. Because especially if you look at the Horizon 2020 priorities, some topics are too large, like society, some topics are too small. They don't have, a good definition, they are not widely accepted and so on. But this was what we had because of, historic reasons. but we will soon, hopefully, have in a few months a much more stable, UN SDG and key enabling technologies based topics, which I'm really curious about because I would like to see distribution of these topics in my projects as well, as you say. And as soon as this is available, we will push our data with this new topic. And the good thing about our data is that, if an ontology is available somewhere, we can classify it in a few days. And we just push it in our database. And that's a good thing because we don't have to do interviews again and collect data and so on. The data, the source data is there. We just change the ontology, push, a few lines of code to the machine and wait a few days and, you have the new results. And that's really a good thing for us. The second thing, bring your own data. I think that's really important. At the moment, as you say, we rely on online sources. And I think we would like to extend to offline sources, especially, small databases sitting in, somebody's computer in some regional policymakers office. And they are important. They are, I don't, say they are not important. They are absolutely important. And we encourage people. Our code is even open. They can do themselves, but they can work with us. We can include these projects in the database and we can expand this database. We are completely happy to have, win-win relationships based on this. But one thing maybe to note this, you are right, we have a little bit of bias because we take projects that are on websites and we don't take projects that is offline. So that is certainly a bias, a limitation. But if you consider, conventional data sources for innovation, people for long have been using patents for an indicator for innovation. We have, most firms do not patent at all, and only a small certain percentage of firms patent. Whereas here, I think I accept you have a bias, but this bias is much less compared to, bias that when you use patents or financial indicators or publications or, other conventional indicators for innovative activity. And I think we are more than happy to explore this bias, understand and include offline sources as well. But I think this is, above the level of performance expected for other sources of innovation as well. So I think I'm confident our results might hold with caveats and limitations, of course, and we need to focus on that, but it is not, exceptionally bad problem compared to other sources. And I think you are finally making a really very important point for degrees of social innovation. And I think it's a really important point because if you look at innovation literature, for instance, we often in our models have a binary variable, if a project or if a firm is innovative or not based on patents, publications, financial data. And this is, a limitation that is mentioned in the literature because, you don't know what patents are more important than the others, but you consider all firms who patent as innovative. But I think we have an edge here, as you say, which I really like and I would like to explore more. We have a system of scoring somehow, which doesn't need to classify firms to a binary allocation of social innovation or not projects. But you can have a score, you can have a score distribution, and you can have, different types, and you can construct your own filters and so on. And I think this is, really very good. And as you said, we explored this in a paper now. We looked at these dimensions, but I think it needs more exploration because it's something new that we haven't brought to the literature much. And I'm more than happy if anybody is interested in exploring these questions more and to work together. I'm more than happy to collaborate. Thank you very much again, Dietmar.
Thank you, Abdullah. Now, I invite the floor to react. You can switch on also your camera and raise your hand and address your question if you wish, or by chat. We are here. And in the meanwhile, I would invite Philippe Laredo, RISIS project coordinator, to give his personal contribution to the discussion. Philippe?
I'll make a point to go on a discussion on ontologies. I I think there will never be one ontology to discuss complex societal problems. And if we go toward mission-oriented policies, transformative policies, societal development goals, we will have multiple definitions about them. So the approach we are taking with the people in Sheffield, CWTS, and with colleagues that are outside RISIS who have different projects, we are trying to put a platform whereby that will help you to map your own ontology and then have the tools to apply it to different data sets. And that's really an important development we want to make. So that, and in a way, it was started by what Abdullah did when he said, we cannot do one definition of social innovation. All right. So in a way, that database that you were seeing is a prototype of the direction that many databases will do when they are enriched. Having options and possibilities of having different tags in a way on the same problem corresponding to the topic or the issue you are addressing, either in policy terms or in research terms. And I really think this is a feature that will be an important dimension of most new developments about data sets in our field. So that was one point I wanted to make. And I was quite pleased that Abdullah said applying it will take us a few days, which means that integration is now, which is a real feature of RISIS, having different entry points which we harmonize through all data sets, so that actors, researchers can, in a way, integrate along this feature different dimensions of innovation. And we have three main features. We have geography. And I do think that this is something that Abdullah, when he will have a 20,000 project, will have to consider, not only country geography, because I think there is as much intranational diversity that international diversity. And within Europe, intranational diversity plays at the regional level. We know it through smart policies, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So that's a very important feature, so that we are not bound to the established classical institutional ways to compare dynamics. When you discuss innovation or transformation, you discuss loci that are mostly below the national level and not at the national level. So that's one first feature. And the second feature, I think, is very, so the second feature are the ontologies we discussed, but the third feature, which is yet an unknown dimension in AZ, is actors. I remember the discussions about how should we enter social innovation. Should we do as usual through actors? Because this is the tradition of all innovation studies, and all innovation indicators from the start from actors. Right? And we collectively decided not to do that for social innovation. We thought that actors might be unstable, might not last, might not be, we might not characterize them the same way as we do for traditional innovation, so that the entry point was more the projects and their transformation power, in a way, than the actors. But when you have so many projects, you can ask yourself, who are the actors? So for instance, Dietmar spoke about the foundations. They might be the direct actor, but there might be a critical actor by pushing the capabilities. We in France are discussing the creation of a specific venture fund, because we consider that we should not depend only, when discussing cultural innovation, about the grandpa, the state, who has the money, and we ask the money for the state, from the state. So we're discussing a very different approach. And that's a very different way of considering critical actors playing in the dynamics of social innovation projects. So I do think that uncovering actors behind, participating, supporting those social innovation projects is a very important dimension. There are also families of projects, and we could have discussed the junk food project in the UK, where, Abdullah, when I'm in Manchester, introduced the junk food groups in supporting our workshops, for food, right? Which for the university was a complete innovation. So, and these projects have reproduced in many places in the UK. So then there are families of projects that might be very interesting because they represented a type of generalization of an experiment that took place somewhere. And I take the families as a very important way forward to discuss generalization. It is not a project that grows, it is a replication with transformation, with local adaptation of a type of project. So it's a generalization by replication. And I'm quite sure that we might find very, very interesting feature if we focus on actors behind these social innovation projects. So I really think it's a very, very important development, and probably the most important to do even before ontologies for the year to come. So that's and that would also help us to see whether we find a new set of actors, or whether foundations as actors, that the Wellcome Trust and others who are key parties, or who are becoming more and more important in funding innovation and problem-based innovation. Think of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Whether these are the same actors that play for social innovation, or whether they are very active, similarly, as they are becoming in problem-based research. So that's an aspect I wanted to discuss. I have two other aspects I wanted to discuss as a conclusion, or before you ask for other questions. The first one is that when we discuss transformative innovation policies or mission-oriented policies, we put very often the innovation into it without knowing what it means. But there are two things we put forward most of the time when we discuss it within another type of process, which is experimentation linked to co-creation with bottom-up actors. And bottom-up actors come in local places. They don't come in the air. So they are mostly in metropolitan areas, in certain places. So place-based innovation becomes very important, and social innovation is place-based. So social innovations have two characteristics for me that are very important. They correspond to the place-based approach that most mission-oriented policies put forward. And they de facto include or offer a very active approach to the inclusion or to the co-creation processes that we are always discussing without knowing what they mean. So for me, the database has not only a value to discuss only social innovation, it has a value to tell us about what transformative policy can mean locally in terms of dynamics, ways of doing, and also ways of generalizing. So it's in a way, it's an exemplar type of database to start discussing differently what it is to innovate bottom up on social dimensions, whether or not they include innovation, or whether or not they include breakthrough innovation, which is the standard type of way we think innovation policies today. The last point I wanted to discuss is it for us is a prototype of the new type of databases linked to big data we will see more and more. And it has three features on that. First, it works on open data. And it works on, second, it works on search mechanisms that are semi-automatic, machine learning, etc., where there are two dimensions. There is an automatic, a human machine interface, where the balance is toward the machine, but the human is the one that enables the machine to work. And the second one is that which Abdullah put forward in a slide that might have surprised many people: the choice of the machine learning tool is absolutely critical. And there's no way you can do a data set without testing the different approaches that are available around. And the testing is an important aspect of the validity of the way of building the new data set. If I take a small example, we have used Cortex to analyze OECD policy debates in innovation, in research and innovation, okay, with all the archives of OECD on the topic. And it took us 22 attempts within Cortex to find the adequate way to organize the classification and the selection. Not even the analysis. And it was 80% of the time for the work. So this is a very important aspect. A second aspect is what type of machine learning tools and processes do you use? How do you organize the comparison? And the third type is the one we have discussed. There is no one definition, but we need to offer a variety of possibilities to users to operate their own definition of the problem, which is included in the database. And all the new databases will, I think, share these three characteristics in the years to come. So these were the three comments I wanted to make, and I share very much the comments that Dietmar made about how can these databases do only exist if people engage in co-creation, in co-building. So you do not create with a wealth of people, but when it is there and it speaks to people, it will live, it will be relevant over time only if other actors engage and bring their resources. So they bring resources because they know other projects, and this is what you discussed, Dietmar, but they also bring their resources because they do new developments which enable to enrich the data by other sorts of tagging or analytical tools. And I think the life of this type of new databases depends very much on the community that is built around these databases to make them live. And that's a real plea for the future. We have too many users, I must say, in RISIS that come for ready-made data, for ready-made enrichments. They don't come to say, well, I will participate in this enrichment because that enrichment would help to analyze the data differently. And I really think this is the road in front of us, even for classical data sets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your analysis, for having illustrated the development of our RISIS families dataset. And I would like to give the floor to Abdullah because there is a question from the floor. Dr. Ogzur Ozer asked, is it possible to employ it to evaluate scientific projects and their outcomes? We are concerning the approach of ACID, Abdullah. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alessia, and thank you very much. First of all, Philippe, I think these are excellent points that you make, and I think they help us to chart a better kind of way forward. And I totally agree with your comments regarding participation and co-creation of this data, and we are very open to that. Regarding to Özgür's question, I think Philippe already answered some of the bits. But I think your question is that we have a machine learning model. Can we apply it to some other questions, not social innovation, but some other questions on science and innovation policy? I think this is certainly possible. You sit on top of a lot of textual data in science funding organizations. They have annual reports that they collect from funded projects and so on. So you have a lot of data that they don't analyze because they don't have capabilities, and we thought this could not be analyzed. And some of this data was not collected for that purpose. In fact, they were collected for monitoring purposes, administrative purposes, and so on. So it is possible to use this kind of analysis. But I'll just echo Philippe. I think there are three challenges, and I think Philippe kind of mentioned really perfectly. But just to summarize. First, I think whatever you do with these kind of methods, you need a good conceptualization. I think sometimes when I speak to policymakers, they think that we press a few buttons at home, and a magical model comes at the end, and we have our data. It is not like that. And I think we went that length of explaining how we define social innovation. And this is precisely because you need a really very good conceptualization so that your machine has a bit better understanding. And we looked at the data even. If you just teach the machine, this is social innovation, this is not. If you give that kind of training data, the machine doesn't understand because it's too broad concept. You need to break into parts as we do. You need to have components or criteria, smaller concepts, even though they are vaguer, smaller vague, less vague in a way. And then the machine performs better. So I think there's a big role for humans to conceptualize at the very beginning. And sometimes we see this as a kind of a data problem, only data problem. We push, the more data we push, the less noise we have. It is not like that, unfortunately. The more conceptualization you have, the better data you have. I think that's for sure. This is the first thing. Second thing, I think Philippe already mentioned as well, it is not fully automated. And I think policymakers sometimes think these methods are, again, automatic. You switch a few lines and then it works. It is not fully manual, but it is at least, I would say 30% manual. You need involvement of humans, you need coding, you need to try different things as Philippe gave the example. You need a lot of human input. And this is not, artificial intelligence, that you leave things and gives you, some magical responses. And the final thing, as Philippe says, it is really very method sensitive as well. And there's always a trade-off. Some methods are very good in classifying more straightforward things. Some methods are better in classifying more contextually important things, and so on. So there's always a kind of a trade-off in the method that you pick, because your data is not perfect. You have an issue most probably. So you need to understand, and policymakers need to understand that it's really method specific, sensitive, and they need to be involved in the choice of method as well. There's no perfect method, there are trade-offs, and this is a kind of basically decision making. And they also need to understand it is never 100% accurate. And when you reach 90% accurate, this is really very good, because this is as much as humans agree. And sometimes when you speak to people, they say, okay, I looked at your data. There are these 3 projects that are not social innovation. Of course, about 10% of my projects are not, classified correctly, because that's what the machine learning model does. But it is correct 90%. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think that was a long answer.
Okay, Dietmar, do you like to address your comments to Abdullah, the one you wrote in your chat, if you want?
Okay, well, it just struck me that Abdullah said that's even better that when we collaborate with the research community to bring their own ontology, because that shortens basically the time span to be accommodated in the ESID, right? So I believe the possibility, and agree with your assessment also, Philippe, that it's not clear, it's underappreciated what kind of effort goes into this. It's behind the curtain, and neither policymakers, funders, not even the research community often understands this, the kind of effort that goes into it, and how can they? So I believe it's part of our own job to educate them a bit. And Abdullah, you also said you have gone to lengths to explain, try to explain this, but I think it's a never-ending job. But still, some kind of points to connect to the work that you are doing, and maybe easing others into this is important, I believe, and offering the possibility to bring your own ontology could even be quite an interesting thing. And maybe just a final comment on the ontology, on the SDGs. I believe you open a huge possibility to achieve a global coverage. I think this will be another extremely important milestone, because then suddenly you get other sources of social innovation as well. Imagine Africa, what's happening there, or even Southeast Asia, for example, where they also use heavy use of technology, but more like in the mobile phone and on platforms supporting mobile phones, and so on. A lot is going on there, from micro banking and loans to, you know, basically everyday life is being conducted through mobile phones there, because you reach remote areas. And I believe that alone opens huge opportunities, and first of all in the coverage, and also in the types of social innovation that you can capture.
Okay, thank you, Dietmar. We have another question from Emanuela Reale. Emanuela, if you want, you can address.
Yes, and thank you for all the things that have been said. I think a very, very interesting presentation, and also the discussion about the new generation of data sets is very important. I have a question for Abdullah, because I don't understand from the presentation whether is it possible to have some information, some categorization about the unit of analysis, I mean the projects. What kind of projects are those that are collected in the data sets, including social innovation? So are there research projects, are there innovation, where they come from? So it's, I mean, in all the presentation, I think that there is a need maybe for better characterize the unit of analysis, what is inside the data set. Because the word projects have several meanings, and I think it's important also in the light of integration of data inside RISIS, because if your unit of entry point is projects, saying what projects are is important to create linkages.
I think that's a really important question, Emanuela, and I think I'm guilty of, assuming that, this is something common across social innovation literature, but, if you're in another literature, of course, you need to define it. And I think one way of doing this is to go to the tool, because when you go to the tool, you will list all our projects. And you can filter by any topic, by any technology, and you can even look at their websites, because, that is open as well. And I think that's something unique, because we provide access to our, source data, and you can look at this. And most of these projects, and maybe if I gave one slide, a few examples of these projects at the very beginning, it could have been, easier to understand. But these projects, mostly non-technological. They're not research projects. They are, They are not, I would say 90% of them are non-technological, but nevertheless, they have a non-technological innovation. And they are more local, and they would like to create some social change. So Philippe mentioned, I can give you a few examples. Philippe mentioned Real Junk Food Project, maybe, for instance. There's one entry in our database, one of the 11,000 projects. So what they do is that they would like to reduce the food waste, and that is their social value that they would like to create. And they go to restaurants and supermarkets and collect food that would otherwise be wasted because it's past sell-by date. And they, present it in a high-end restaurant, but also in a low-end restaurant. So this is just an example. And this is a kind of a social innovation that has a social objective. So it scores really high in objectives, reducing food waste. It has high actor and actor interactions because there are lots of volunteers, and they work with restaurants. They engage, a lot of people in, different ways in terms of their scores. And it is one in innovativeness. It doesn't use any technology, but it uses a kind of organizational innovativeness. So it's middle score in innovativeness. And in long-term change, the output criteria that we have, I think it's scored 1 as well. So it has, some long-term impact, but, it's not the main thing for this project. So this is just one example out of 11,000, but these are local, non-technological, socially oriented projects.
Okay, thank you so much, Abdullah, for your answer. I would invite the floor to react. We have some minutes before ending this very, very intense policymaker session. In the meanwhile, I remind you in the chat our next events, that is the research seminar on regional knowledge production across Europe. And we are really at the end. I wish to thank you, all the participants, Dietmar Lampert from Center for Social Innovation, Philippe Laredo, RISIS Project Coordinator, Emanuela Reale, and especially Abdullah Gok for his intense journey inside ESIT, European Social Innovation Database. I would remind you our next policymaker session that will be on the next year, at the end of May, on NATPRO and EFIL, with a study by Irkresien Har and IT. Thank you so much for your participation. I see one hand. Okay, you can address.
Yeah, just to say, Ricardo here. Just to say, I belong to the community of cultural innovation, which is a fortunate or unfortunate issue that was raised by ESRI when they called this Social and Cultural Innovation Strategy Working Group for their roadmap. So there are 4 infrastructures for social innovations in Italy, CESDA, ESS, SHARE, and RISIS, and we have 6 infrastructures for cultural innovation in Italy. And I have pledged to write a paper together with Andrea Archibugi and Andrea Bonacorsi for setting up indicators for measuring the impact of cultural innovation, which is a long way. We're really in deep trouble, but I very much like what you're doing, and be sure that we will follow your path. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And I'm more than happy to collaborate if you want to discuss anything. Please.
Exactly. Thank you for that.
Well done. We have a very welcome new collaboration, new work together. And I invite you, concerning this great collaboration in the community, to go on our social media and website to see all the information about our community, RISIS community. Thank you again, and enjoy your Friday. Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.